1964, archaeologists excavating a well shaft near ancient Sparta pulled up something that stopped the dig. Infant bones, dozens of them. Fractured skulls, twisted spines, some no more than a few days old. For decades, the story was the same. Sparta threw its weak babies into a pit called the Apothetai. Textbooks printed it. Documentaries repeated it. The movie 300 opened with it. But the bones in that well told a different story. Because mixed in with those infant remains were the bones of adults. Men, women, people who had lived full lives and then ended up in the same place as the babies. Which raises a question no one in Hollywood wanted to ask. What kind of society throws both its newborns and its grown citizens into the same disposal site? This video is about what Sparta actually was, not the movie version, not the motivational poster version. The version that turned a 7-year-old boy named Leonidas into the kind of man who would march 300 fathers to a narrow pass in northern Greece, knowing none of them would come back. And the version that explains why, 2,500 years later, we still haven't figured out what we're really applauding. Before we go any further, if you haven't subscribed yet, now is the time. This is the kind of history they left out of the textbooks and Hollywood cleaned up. Hit subscribe, it is free, it takes 1 second, and it helps us keep making these videos. Now, let us get back to it. To understand what Leonidas became, you have to understand what Sparta sat on top of. Sometime around the 8th century BC, the Spartans conquered a neighboring region called Messenia. The people living there, the Messenians, were not killed. They were not driven out. They were absorbed. They became the helots. The helots farmed the land. They harvested the grain. They pressed the olives, tended the livestock, and produced the food that fed every Spartan household. Without the helots, Sparta did not eat, and the helots outnumbered the Spartans. Ancient sources vary, but some estimates place the ratio at 7 helots for every 1 Spartan citizen. Others go higher. The exact number is debated, the imbalance is not. This created a problem that shaped every decision Sparta ever made. The entire Spartan economy depended on a population that had every reason to revolt. The Messenians had not chosen subjugation. They had been conquered, they remembered, and they waited. In the 7th century BC, they did revolt. The Second Messenian War nearly broke Sparta. Ancient sources describe a conflict so desperate that Sparta came close to collapse. The poet Tyrtaeus, writing during or shortly after the war, produced verses urging Spartan soldiers to hold the line, not against a foreign empire, but against the people working their own fields. Sparta survived that war, but surviving it changed everything. After the Messenian revolt, Sparta reorganized itself around a single priority, making sure it never happened again. Every institution, every ritual, every law that followed can be traced back to one calculation. How do a few thousand citizens maintain permanent control over a population that vastly outnumbers them? The answer was not walls. Sparta famously had none. The answer was not technology or wealth. The answer was the total restructuring of Spartan life around the production of one thing: obedient soldiers. At the age of 7, Spartan boys were taken from their families. This was not optional. This was not a boarding school for the ambitious. Every male citizen's son entered the agogia, the state-run training system that would occupy the next 13 years of his life. The boys were organized into groups called agalai, herds. Not classes, not cohorts. Herds. They were given 1 cloak per year, no shoes, no bedding. They slept on rushes they had to pull from the riverbank themselves, by hand, without a blade. Food was deliberately kept insufficient, not by accident, not through scarcity. The rations were calculated to leave the boys perpetually hungry. They were expected to supplement their meals by stealing. This is the part that gets repeated in documentaries as if it were clever, a training method for future soldiers. But the full mechanism was more specific than that. If a boy stole food successfully, nothing happened. He ate. If a boy was caught, he was beaten. The punishment was not for the theft, it was for the failure, for being detected. Plutarch records the story of a Spartan boy who stole a fox cub and hid it under his cloak. When an adult approached, the boy stood still. The fox began clawing and biting into his stomach. The boy said nothing. He did not move. He died standing, his intestines opened by the animal, rather than reveal what he had stolen. Whether that specific story is literal or apocryphal, the fact that Spartans told it to each other as a model tells you what the system valued. Not strength, not intelligence, the suppression of visible suffering. As the boys grew older, the training escalated. They were organized into competitive units and encouraged to fight each other. Plutarch describes organized brawls, where boys punched, kicked, and bit with no rules, and no intervention from adults. The purpose was not to find the strongest, it was to identify who would keep fighting after the pain became unbearable. At certain stages, boys were subjected to public flogging at the altar of Artemis Orthia. This was not punishment, it was ritual. Boys were whipped until they bled, and the measure of success was silence. Pausanias, writing centuries later, noted that some boys died during the ritual. The priests monitored the flogging by watching a wooden statue of Artemis. When the image grew heavier, the blows were considered sufficient. Foreign visitors came to watch. By the time a boy reached 18, he had spent over a decade in a system designed to accomplish something very specific. Not education, not enlightenment, conditioning. The agoge produced men who could endure pain without flinching, who could obey without questioning, who could stand in a phalanx formation for hours in summer heat, wearing 60 pounds of bronze, and not break rank when the man next to them took a spear through the throat. This was the system that produced Leonidas. He entered it at 7. He graduated from it as a man who had never known a single day of autonomous decision-making. Every meal, every sleeping arrangement, every act of violence and deprivation had been managed by the state, and the state had one use for him. There is a part of Spartan training that does not appear in the movie 300. It does not appear in most popular accounts of Sparta at all. It is called the Krypteia. Each year, Spartan authorities selected the most capable young men, those who had excelled in the agoge, and gave them a specific assignment. They were sent into the countryside, at night, alone, armed with a dagger. No armor, no supplies. Their mission, move through Helot territory and kill any Helot who appeared strong, organized, or capable of leadership. Plutarch describes this directly. The young Spartans hid during the day and emerged at night. They targeted Helots, working the fields, traveling the roads, or gathering in groups. The killings were not battlefield engagements. They were nighttime operations, carried out against unarmed laborers. This was not a rogue practice. It was state-sanctioned. Each year, the Spartan ephors, the elected officials who governed alongside the kings, formally declared war on the Helots. This legal declaration served a specific function. Under Greek custom, killing during peacetime carried religious pollution. The annual declaration of war removed that obstacle. Any Helot killed by a Spartan during the Krypteia was killed within a legal framework. The targets were not random. Thucydides records an incident during the Peloponnesian War that reveals the logic. The Spartans announced that Helots, who had served with distinction in battle, should come forward to be honoured. Around 2,000 Helots presented themselves. The Spartans crowned them, paraded them past the temples, and then every single one of them disappeared. No one, Thucydides writes, could say how each of them was killed. 2,000 men, selected for competence, eliminated because competence in a subjugated population is a threat. The Krypteia operated on the same principle, applied continuously. The system did not wait for rebellion to begin. It removed the potential for rebellion before it could organize. This is the context that is missing from every popular telling of Leonidas and the 300. The men who stood at Thermopylae were not simply warriors trained for external enemies. They were products of a system designed, first and foremost, for internal control. The skills that made them effective in the phalanx, obedience, silence, the capacity to kill without hesitation, were the same skills they had practiced on Helot farm workers in the dark. One of the most frequently cited facts about ancient Sparta is that Spartan women had more freedom than women elsewhere in Greece. This claim requires context. Spartan women could own property. They could inherit land. They exercised publicly and received physical training. In Athens, women were confined to the household. In Sparta, they moved through public space with a degree of autonomy that shocked other Greeks. But the purpose of that autonomy was specific. Spartan women were physically trained because Sparta believed physically strong mothers produced physically strong sons. Plutarch states this explicitly. The exercise regimen, running, wrestling, throwing the javelin, was not designed for the women's benefit. It was designed to optimize their reproductive output. Marriage customs reflected the same priority. Spartan brides had their heads shaved and were dressed in men's clothing for the wedding night. The groom, who had spent his entire life in the company of men, would visit briefly in the dark, then return to his barracks. Some scholars suggest this ritual was designed to ease the transition from the all-male bonding of the agoge to heterosexual contact. Husbands under 30 continued to live in their mess halls. They visited their wives in secret. Plutarch says some men fathered children before they had ever seen their wife's face in daylight. If a marriage did not produce children, the state intervened. Xenophon describes an arrangement where an older husband could introduce a younger man to his wife for the purpose of conception. If a man admired another citizen's wife for her bearing and temperament, he could request access to her, with the husband's consent, to produce children. These were not scandals, they were policy. The Spartan system treated reproduction, the way it treated military training, as a state function that could not be left to individual preference.